Hey there, anthropologists. Welcome to another video. I'm Eric Olson, professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College. And I'm going to start off with a question. What do Rafiki from The Lion King, Aang from Avatar The Last Airbender, and Aku Aku from the video game Crash Bandicoot all have in common? Well, technically they're all considered shamans. You probably have heard this term used a lot when referring to, quote, primitive cultures, especially non-Western cultures. Unfortunately, this term has, at least in my opinion, become too much of a catch-all term, much in the same way that hunter-gatherer is a term used for pretty much anyone who practices a subsistence system that isn't agriculture and basically isn't a non-Western culture. It bottles up all this global diversity of religion and belief and kind of shoves it into this very broad definition that doesn't really have a whole lot of analytical utility. So where do we get the term shaman from anyway? Well, we get it from ethnographic accounts of the Tungusic, I believe I'm mispronouncing that. It's not my research area, but the Tungusic-speaking peoples of Siberia. So they're mostly, hanging out in this region of Siberia and over in here. So like north of Manchuria, north and east of Lake Baikal, which is right here. So this region of the world. So, this is where ethnographic accounts studying the term shaman, it's what they called these religious practitioners in their language. So that's where we get it in that region of the world. But then social scientists in the 19th century, such as Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, considered shamanism the, quote, original religion. And this wasn't really based on any archaeological evidence. It was more based on sort of their own reasoning and logic in the 19th century. This seems to be primitive. It's based on this idea that primitive peoples that we see today are relics of the past. And so they kind of projected it and assumed that shamanism must be how early religions must have looked like. But what exactly do shamans do? Well, that's where things get a little muddy. So I went to all of my intro to anthropology textbooks, which you can sort of see here. And I've got 10 of them. And I technically have more if you count. I have like 2 or 3 copies that are the second edition of one of them. But, that's neither here nor there. Surprise, surprise, an anthropology professor has a lot of anthropology textbooks. The oldest one is from 1977, and the newest one is from 2020. This is the one I use for class. And then I also have a book on magic, witchcraft, and religion. Say that 10 times fast. The 5th edition by Lehman and Myers. And so I went through all of these to try and find a definition and, see how the definition of shaman has changed over time. Much in the same way on the dictionaries episode of the From the Archives podcast, I talk about looking at the definition of words and how they change through time. And I found a remarkably consistent definition that unfortunately used sort of modern economic concepts to define a shaman in terms of like part-time and full-time. So I'm actually going to read you Conrad Kotak's 2005 textbook definition, which I think kind of encapsulates all of the different definitions that I found in these textbooks over the course of 50 years. And his definition reads as follows: part-time religious figures who mediate between people and supernatural beings and forces. These include terms such as mediums, curers, witch doctors, spiritualists, astrologers, palm readers, and other diviners. That's a lot of variation encapsulated in one definition. Nearly all of the definitions use the term part-time. And really, I'm putting on my headphones because I want to hear this. Every time I kept reading part-time, I couldn't help but think of the Indiana Jones movie where he just says it so defeatedly, like, yeah, I work part-time, as if this definition is somehow reflective of how shamans would view themselves, as if part-time is really how they should define themselves within the community. Sort of like, that's not the perspective they probably would take to view their work as only part-time, or kind of, I guess you could say, downplaying it by calling it part-time. Here, let me just play the clip. It's 4 seconds.
You're a teacher?
Part-time.
Part-time. I don't know. That's what I envisioned, like an anthropologist going out to someone who's a religious practitioner in this concept and saying, "You're a shaman? Part-time." I don't know. I think the definition itself is sort of downplaying the value system within the culture and the society in which they rely on this religious practitioner. And so that's just sort of my 2 cents on it. But right, this definition includes, like I said, curers, witch doctors, mediums, spiritualists, astrologers, palm readers, other diviners. By that definition, we could probably include Dr. Facilier from Princess and the Frog. We could include Mulan. We could include Moana. We could include Miguel from Coco. Are we starting to notice a pattern here? No, it's not Disney. The pattern is that these are all non-Western cultures, and they're non-white. These are... It's sort of in the same kind of problematic issues that we have with the term hunter-gatherer. It's oftentimes used as a catch-all for non-Western cultures that don't practice agriculture. What are we going to call them? I guess hunter-gatherers. And so it really kind of, shrinks down all that variation across the globe and just puts it into one category of non-Western. And sort of these, quote, primitive religious practices. And remember how I said, sociologists and Max Weber and Emil Durkheim had this perspective of shamanism as an early form of religion? Yeah, well, that's also in the same vein of, relics of the past, this view that white Western culture is, quote unquote, the most progressed culture, this idea of unilineal evolution, which no anthropologist today supports or endorses. To be clear, modern anthropology vehemently opposes the idea of unilineal evolution, but we still see that reflected in media and culture and how shamans are portrayed, right? I mean, I started off the video talking about Rafiki and the Lion King, Aku Aku and Crash Bandicoot, this sort of, primitive, simple, less intelligent, if you will, view of shamanism, unfortunately. And to really illustrate that example, I wanted to talk about a clip from the video game Far Cry, which, for those of you who have not played it, I ended up playing it because, well, it's a video game about Paleolithic Europe. You're a character in what might be considered modern-day France, and the game came out in 2016. And this is the introduction to the character Tensei, who is the shaman character. So let's just look at how he's sort of portrayed and start to reflect on how that might, parallel those 19th century unilineal evolution views.
Guaita Walsnar. Tisay Hassan.
Fair warning, there is it's video game animal cruelty, but I just wanted to give you the warning ahead of time that he's going to harm the animal in the game.
Mu salwa padawaida, uhaita, tinsai. Nay. Jassa. Ujasarda. Hassan. Ashai Baja.
That's probably a good enough example to illustrate there. So we can see, this is sort of the modern notion of what shamanism is, right? And to Western medicine and the ideology of Western medicine, you might consider it dirty, you might consider it unsanitary, you might consider it gross. But again, that's from your own cultural biases and perspectives. And the ideology of Western medicine would argue that this is something that we should stop practicing. It basically views it as unproductive and not useful in society. Essentially, Western doctors would consider this maladaptive, or the idea that this is not beneficial to the species. Sort of like how If you wore a parka in the Gobi Desert, during the day at least, that would also be considered maladaptive because you'd get heat stroke and die. And so the parka culture of the Gobi Desert would die out, in theory. Or at least that's the perspective. But social scientists and philosophers like Frantz Fanon in the mid-20th century argued that this is very much an ideology that reinforces cultural superiority, and it's usually done in the same breath or in the same mentality as viewing these as primitive cultural legacies or relics of the past. But you can see the logic doesn't make sense there. If we consider this something that humans did in the past, then it can't possibly be maladaptive because we're here today. So, you might be putting yourself at risk of getting an individual infected. So in this case, Tensei might have some bad, bowel issues later on from drinking blood or something to that effect, or might get an infection. But this is not something that is going to lead to an extinction level event of a species. So in that regards, it can't really be viewed as maladaptive. So it's sort of reinforcing this ideological superiority. So we always need to be careful of that. And I guess ultimately the point I'm making here is that Tensei is a fictional character, and he is in the same category, at least if we consider them shaman, as Rafiki, as Mulan, as Aang from Avatar. And so it's this so much diversity being encapsulated by arguably a term that doesn't really have any analytical utility. And so what commonly happens with these discussions is I circle back to, it all comes down to classification and systematics, or the methods by which we classify things. And really, that's mostly all I wanted to talk about today. So consider that next time you're talking about shamans or thinking about shamans, is what are you really talking about, and is this term useful in what you're discussing? That's going to do it for today's video. I will see you in the next one, and until then, never stop learning.